But let's get to our program now here. Of course, the natural world is exposed to stressors all the time and have developed interesting coping strategies. So in this session, I promise you some interesting lessons as we lean into our animal friends. We will have camels, bears, myriad of insects, such as predatory wasp, and we might even throw in a little red-bellied black snake. Is that a correct name?
That is correct. Yeah.
That is like a really nasty little thing from Australia.
Hey.
So we will learn about the human expansion, putting stressors on the animal habitats, affecting in the end also human health. But first, what is life really? And is there even a consensus on this topic? Ingemar Ernberg, professor at the Karolinska, has for many years been running a successful lecture series on what is life. So, please.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to give the first talk after the party. I will be a little bit slower than usual. But thank you, Jim, Axel, and Peter Bussen, and all the organizers for honoring me with this starting up. Researcher working with tumor viruses, but as said, I have had a deep interest in this enigmatic question, what is life? And it's worth emphasizing there is no scientific consensus definition of life. And even society doesn't really have a good definition of life. And I think that's very wise, because we don't understand life yet. You may argue with me, but that's my clear conclusion after these 20 years of struggling with the question. This is my talk in brief summaries. And these are some of the close to 300 lectures we have had in this series. It's not only a series, it's a bit like a program, and we have also run it as PhD courses or doctorate courses. We have had 22 courses on what is life since 2005. And here have been speaking high and low, stars, Nobel Prize winners, and young, interesting stars. I think the largest look into, as most of the lectures are recorded and they are out on the YouTube, the later ones are out on the YouTube, but I think the most looked upon was by Jeremy England from MIT when he presented his slightly different theory of evolution with more than 200,000 viewers so far. This series has led me both into fantastic networks of scientists, but also all over the world. Here I'm outside the Altai cave in the Altai mountains, where Svante Pääbo found, with a Russian scientist, two little fingers, which he could define was not Homo sapiens, but the Denisova man, or the Altai man. So the what is life is one of the three really persecuting questions of mankind, existential. The three most important questions classically: origin of life, or what is life? Origin of the world, or what is the world? And of course, the hardest one, what is consciousness? Here is sort of my bottom line, so no surprises from now on. Living things are made up of interactions in networks, resulting in complex systems. No surprise. So the key words are networks and relations. I would even say that biological science has to switch perspective a little bit from being the classical paradigm, DNA, RNA, protein, to a science of relations and interactions. And I think it has sort of been here and there in the talks in the past 2 days a little bit. I want to point to two important historical points from this perspective. First, our great scientist Berzelius. He competes with Linné to be the biggest Swedish scientist ever. The difference was that Berzelius, living 100 years after Linné, or 70 years after Linné, he was clear on the dynamics of the world, the dynamics of chemistry and dynamics of living system. And he actually opened up physiology with his animal chemistry studies. He coined the concept protein, but particularly catalysis. And here is he came a little bit close to the heart of the matter, what is life. Catalysis is extremely important to try to get closer to understand the force of the living things. He was also a founder of the Karolinska Institute, one of them, and he was also the one who corrected the course of this academy 200 years ago. Another even greater hero is Leonardo da Vinci. Here is his famous painting, but according to Martin Kemp, whom he has also invited to this series 2 years ago, and is the greatest living expert on Leonardo today from Oxford, Leonardo was really an engineer. His interest was very much into water and air and mechanics. And the art, according to Martin Kemp, was sort of a way to illustrate the engineering. So Mona Lisa is sort of an accident on a route that was not really intended to be an artist's route. Interestingly, Leonardo reflects on things that are extremely relevant to us here, and I think he has actually coined or actually described the oceanic feeling, which we heard from Isabella Levine on Monday. By the ancients, man was termed a lesser world. Man is composed of water, earth, air, and fire. His body is an analog for the world. And most importantly, just as man has in himself the lake of the blood, in which the lungs increase and decrease during breathing, so the body of the earth has its oceanic seas, which likewise increase and decrease every 6 hours with the breathing of the world. Similarly, the oceanic sea fills the body of the earth with infinite veins of water. Almost poetic. So, what do we inherit? Well, basically no one on the streets of Stockholm would not know that we inherit DNA from the father and the mother. Here in Lennart Nilsson's classical picture of the chromosomes. DNA, what is DNA? If you put DNA here on the table, nothing happens. If you put DNA from any species into a glass of water, nothing happens. Well, it becomes a little bit like jelly. If you put DNA on a petri dish, nothing happens. So obviously, DNA is not sufficient for life. DNA doesn't contain the spark of life. It cannot initiate living things. Once we had the knowledge about DNA from the 50s, maybe the greatest discovery of all in the last century, the question was, of course, how can now DNA translate into electricity, into movement, into shapes of cells, and all kinds of the functions of cells. Several hundred cell types with extremely diverse phenotypes, fibroblast skin cells, liver cells, brain cells, etc. And of course, the first answer was, and I was here, I was working in the research area in those days, in the 70s and 80s. The transcription factors and their binding sites in DNA would solve the problem. And human brain is very slow. It took us about 10 years to realize, so what? Who decides which transcription factors are available? Oh, okay, then came in the early 90s or late 80s, epigenetics. DNA methylation came to save us. Took another 5 or 10 years to find out, well, who decides what should be methylated? Could not be solved. Then came epigenetics 2. Oh, the chromatin language. Who decides what should be acetylated, methylated, etc. in the chromatin? So whatever, we could never find the root of the cause. The causality was very unclear here. In that world, we had a very linear view of biology. I think it's still quite dominating. We were thinking about hierarchical system. We were chasing a mastermind in the system. DNA is the code of life. And we had some kind of stretching out into networks. But it was all basically Newtonian classical physics. And the metaphors dominating was that the cell is a machine. And we were using, 20 years ago, electric wiring diagrams to understand the networks of biology. So very much an engineering perspective into biology. This is a little bit closer to the truth. This is a cartoon of the metabolism of a cell as it was known 20 years ago. It's even worse today, or even more today. There are hundreds of thousands of little activities here in local networks and big networks. In the middle, you can see a circle, which is the Krebs cycle. So how do we encompass this into the picture of what is life? Well, in fact, the intracellular network is the most fundamental, the most original, the most basic network in biology, and from that, biology has built itself its world. Life is constructing itself using networks to all levels. It started probably with prebiotic autocatalytic small networks, the intracellular network, and then it goes on to the organ, the individual level, the brain, the family, the society, the ecologic network, the ecosphere, and the internet, etc., etc. And of course, a very interesting question for network science is it the same principle of the networks at all levels here? So life is very much a question of networks upon networks upon networks upon networks upon networks. Did you get the message? Networks. And then we run into modern natural science or modern physics, complex systems, causality problems, which has not been solved at all, robustness of these networks, emergent properties, agency and function, self-organization, and network models. And I have to mention this book by Philip Ball, recently published, which actually, I think, addresses this in the most modern possible way. If I had written the book, it would have been a little bit better, but it is itself quite good. And the book is called How Life Works. I recommend it. So the cell is the most fundamental biological network of living things. I mean, that's where it has started. The first prebiotic evolution, the chemical evolution leading to the LUCA, the first common ancestral cell, was a question of small starting up network. And it's closest, the cell network is closest to the origin of life, and I will come back to that. So we have the same code in all cells in the body, more or less at least, in an individual. And still we can generate hundreds of cell types which are as different as elephants, from giraffes, from bees, from wasps. So how is this possible? And the only possibility is that it's intrinsic in the translation between the DNA and the phenotype of the cell through the network. So network, somewhere in the network is where we have to look for the secrets now, how genotype leads to phenotype. So what do we inherit? Well, the DNA, there is no discussion about that, but we inherit the whole network. We inherit the whole machinery. We inherit the whole body plan in the form of the egg cell, with all its organelles, mitochondria, whatever, you know, and it's there. And DNA can't do anything without that. So it is just for DNA to move in the ready building. And I think that's where we have to shift the perspective. No one has been able yet even to lead the discussion. How much of the information for life do we actually get from the structure of the egg and the network? Is that more than in the DNA even? So DNA is, of course, part of this network. DNA is extremely important. DNA allows the network to find new fresh proteins if something is broken down. But DNA is not leading the process, as little as a network. So what we inherit is the genes, the promoters, the enhancers, but also the body plan, I call it, the whole cell with all this compartmentalized function. And Darwin was wise enough not to even discuss how did this complex thing of the cell complex cell, how did it start? He doesn't even mention that. What is now the prime operative level of evolution? Of course, it's not the genome. The prime level is the function, the cell in its context and in the environment. So here we have, I think, a modern enigma of Darwin's evolutionary theory. No doubt DNA plays a big role, but we know now that cells has an enormous ability to adapt even without changing the genome. We call it plasticity. And of course, plasticity is not linked to eternal plasticity, but it means that if there is a big crisis in the climate, some cells might be able to adapt momentarily and doesn't have to wait for the Darwinian evolution in the genes to catch up. So the other statement here, and I think that would require a whole coffee break or more to really explain what I mean, but life constructs itself, that is self-organization, into the adjacent possible. And these two phrases, life constructs itself into the adjacent possible, they are both captured from one of the big thinkers who wrote the book Origin in 1994, Stuart Kauffman. And I think there is a lot into these words, and you need to think about them. So you can write down networks from this talk, and you can write down this sentence. Life constructs itself into the adjacent possible. So who makes now the decisions in the cell? Well, Philip Ball, in his book, How Life Works, he has a whole chapter on cells and decisions, decisions, decisions. And of course, we are not allowed to talk about decisions in something that doesn't really have a brain. But in fact, cells make decisions. No doubt about that. And just to say, network constitute the immediate link between the constituent biomolecules, that is the proteins, the glycoproteins, the RNA, the nucleotides, and the phenotype. DNA doesn't program anything. Well, this is another big hero, Dennis Noble in Oxford, who said this about 20 years ago, just to provoke, you know, that the old idea that if you see DNA, you understand life. No, it's wrong. Genes are participants of the intracellular network. And causality, decision-making, is a process we do not understand at all. It's not very close to the way our brain wants to see causality. We want to see linear things. We want to see a white billiard ball or pool ball hit a red pool ball, and it goes into the hole, into the little hole. It doesn't work like that in these systems, and we have to be just respectful and humble that most of these things we do not yet understand. In fact, we do not yet understand life. And just to put in a little bit of science, and unfortunately not my own, Joanna Javier leads a huge international network of 200 young scientists working on what is life and origin of life. They have homepage and whatsoever. And she has made a number of very similar publications from 2020 and onward on the fossils that we can see in the cell, in the human cell. We can see the fossil, the archaeology of the original networks. That's her claim, at least. So it has here something called the autotrophic core, and it's an ancient network of 404 reactions which converts hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and ammonium into amino acids, bases, and cofactors. And she's claiming that this is sort of seen throughout evolution. So it is as much or more conserved in a way than the DNA itself. And of course, it was there before DNA. So my conclusions are about the fundamentals of life. All living things have a complex build-up. They are made of large networks and make up parts of large networks. So networks upon networks. Living things are built of networks upon networks upon networks. I already said that once. And finally, the properties, the functions, and the agency of living things emerge from relations formed in these networks. Nothing in the living world has any meaning at all, neither to us nor to the living thing itself, without the context. Context, relations, context, relation. Biology is a science of relationships. And I think I am there. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, the standing ovation. Yeah, we're going to do it in the morning. Come on, please. It's like a boxer having been in the ring. Excellent. Relationships, networks. Then, of course, we have the big web of life on Earth, the communication between man and animals. So, we have Prishani Vengetas with us. She's going to mention the red black belly snake a little bit. Promise me. I'm a snake what's it called? Snake phobiac. Or yeah,
Me
so
too.
I always hear these things. So what type of pressure is rising agricultural land usage and deforestation putting on the animal world and its natural habitats? What type of new zoonotic diseases will we see, or even the emergence of old diseases? And what type of stress is this putting on the animals, affecting their immune systems and in the end also us? Prishani has come all the way from Australia, working as a conservation veterinary at the World Wildlife Foundation. You are most welcome. Please begin with a snake. Tell us where you saw it.
I'm sorry, but there's not going to be a red belly black snake in this story today. But I mean, they're beautiful, but they can bite you. But what a way to go!
And you found in your garden, you told me.
Oh yes. But you just have to know how to treat them well. All right. When I was 4 years old, I told my parents I wanted to be a veterinarian because I loved animals and I thought that meant I got to, play with dogs and cats all day long. By the time I graduated, I wanted to be a zoo vet because then that meant I got to heal tigers and elephants all day long. And then one day, when I was sitting in the forests of Borneo with the smoke from bushfires in the air, bordered by deforestation, and bottle feeding this orphaned sun bear cub, I realized that what I actually wanted was to heal our world. Because we can't get to health without the protection and preservation of the natural world. So today, I'm a conservation veterinarian for WWF, and that means that I work to integrate veterinary medicine, public health, and conservation biology to address health challenges equitably and sustainably, if I can. Some of those ecological health tipping points are those that we've discussed: climate change, pollution, and agriculture. But today, I'm in my scrubs. Let's write a script together for reducing the nature-based drivers of disease. Natural cycles of disease are an integral part of ecosystems, with infectious organisms playing an important role in the population dynamics of animals and plants. However, you probably know that over 60% of known infectious diseases in humans come from animals, both wild and domestic. And over 75% of emerging infectious diseases come from animals as well. Wildlife represents the most significant reservoir of emerging zoonotic disease. And yet the average size of wildlife populations has fallen by 73%. We show you this graph every day, and it's because we really want to drill this point home. We're in the 6th mass extinction caused by us, and we are losing species before we can even define or describe them. But then you might be wondering, why, if things are so bad, is infectious disease then still rising? There are two main reasons for this, in my opinion. One is that wildlife are more than just vectors of disease. They are predators, they are pollinators, they're seed dispersers and ecosystem engineers. Wildlife, biodiversity in all its forms, is critical to the health of this planet. The second reason is that biodiversity loss is creating a higher interface between humans, animals, and the environment. And this is leading to what is called the third biggest risk to the planet, according to the World Economic Forum. This is in part because biodiversity loss and disease share common drivers like agricultural, industrial, and human population pressures that lead to land use change and deforestation. That's been linked to the emergence of over 30% of new zoonoses since 1940. Climate change, we know, appears to parallel the global spread of infectious disease, like highly pathogenic avian influenza, the buzzwords, and it can alter the behavior, ecology, and physiology of birds, poultry, and wild. In particular, the habitat, food availability, and breeding sites of migratory birds are dramatically impacted. by increased storm and drought frequency, lowered water tables, and the rise in sea level. So then you couple this with the stress from sustained temperatures, environmental extremes, and deforestation, and a wild bird's resilience and resistance to disease is dramatically impacted. And then it ultimately impacts the ability of a virus to evolve, spread, and cause clinical disease. Good news. On a positive note, avian influenza and COVID-19 and other infectious diseases have contributed to this rising understanding that the health of humans, animals, and the environment are deeply connected and interlinked and interdependent. However, the importance of the environment in that mix is the least well understood and the least prioritized, unfortunately. Let's take COVID as an example. Insofar as we can understand, COVID has resulted in the loss of over 7 million human lives. Correct me if I'm wrong. But what about the loss of wildlife lives? How many have we lost? How many deaths? We don't know. And the reason for that is because pandemics increase biodiversity threats, like forest logging, poaching, and wildlife trafficking. It erodes protection of parks and vulnerable species, and it forestalls the monitoring that's required to make those impacts visible. This work also requires money, and namely its grants and donations. And pandemics decrease the funding streams that support conservation. A study by WWF showed that investing in nature-based drivers of disease solutions is 1/20th the cost of responding once a pandemic has emerged. But how do we write that script then for a healthier world? What are the parts of a script? We've got the prescriber, the medication, the dose, the frequency. That's our baseline for our patient Earth. Now, when I was a new graduate veterinarian, I didn't always know what medications to give or the dose, the protocol for treatment. I was still in the infancy of my journey as a clinician. I needed a manual or a formulary, and I'm sure many of you might remember those early days. We are now in the same or similar situation with conservation, when the true value of biodiversity has yet to be reflected in economics, policy, and implementing frameworks. But we're making progress. Last year, at the end of the year, I was at COP16 in Colombia, and CBD parties approved a global action plan on biodiversity and health. The plan embraces a One Health holistic approach that's designed to curb the emergence of zoonotic disease, decrease or prevent non-communicable disease, and promote sustainable ecosystems. It's perhaps the most notable and the most recent framework, and it brings together health professionals, conservationists, and policymakers to underline the need for education, support for traditional medicine, and habitat protection, while highlighting the importance of youth as vital contributors to conservation and health initiatives, and also recognizing the need of vulnerable populations. So then, with this global action plan as our overarching guidance, we now need to dispense some medication for Earth. So WWF, in an effort to determine what this might be, started a One Health task force in 2021. And it brought together 32 members of various disciplines from across the world. And together we launched this report called Towards a Healthy Planet. And it details our approach to address the anthropogenic and nature-based drivers of disease, through guidance on implementing 6 key strategies or solutions for planetary health. They are wildlife trade, preventive medicine, landscape immunity, pathogen early warning and monitoring, behavior change, and sustainable livestock management. But like with all patients, the treatment has to be tailored. Different landscapes, species, and communities might require only one of these strategies, and others might require a multimodal approach. Let's start easy. Overall, the patient Earth needs a strong immune system. If you're seeing an increasing number of bats in your urban landscapes, it might be an indication that the resilience of nature has been compromised. And then injecting immunity into the landscape means taking steps like forest restoration and town planning, which was touched on a little bit yesterday. And then that ensures that animals and humans' interactions and their associated pathogens are not overly stressed or forced to aggregate. Another necessary component is preventive medicine. Unfortunately, it's often thought of as simply insurance for human health. But proactive preventive programs can support wildlife and environmental health. This is a koala with chlamydia. In Australia, chlamydia can be found in up to 48% of wild koalas on the east coast, and it affects their ocular and urogenital systems, affecting their ability to breed. But targeted vaccinations can reduce mortality by 64%, and then it will improve their ability to breed and function in the ecosystem. Koalas are certainly cute, but they are also controls of canopy density, fire risk. They fertilize the soil, and they benefit many other threatened species. Across the globe, to the Amazon River, WWF are helping local organizations to implement pathogen early warning and monitoring systems to track the growing risk of methylmercury in both river dolphins and the drinking water of local communities. This can promote early monitoring and intervention to respond and reduce the impact of disease. But the sharing openly of epidemiological data between health sectors and borders is certainly an area that needs work, particularly in the wildlife space. This is not just in South America, it is across the world. Globally, further efforts can be made regarding wildlife trade. This multi-billion-dollar industry transports millions of wildlife across the world and their parts every year for food, pets, biomedical research, traditional medicine, and other cultural and recreational uses. The intensified human-animal interfaces along this chain increases the risk of zoonosis, but it also decreases biodiversity and ecosystem resource loss. But disease biosurveillance along this chain in legal trade and illegal trade is largely absent, putting humanity at significant risk. And the four main interventions that we can take to address the supply of products into the market, the demand for items from the market, the safe processing of products, the efficacy and application of controls and regulations. But while these might be priority interventions in the Mekong, primary efforts can look very different in the natural grasslands and savannas of Africa, where livestock use is predominant and the culturally embedded form, where land use, herders, livestock all live together and share resources. In these areas, sustainable livestock management practices like predator-proof crawling and separation of water sources can preserve biodiversity, prevent soil erosion, improve carbon sequestration, and provide nutrition for animals, while also contributing to poverty reduction, food security, and agricultural development. One strategy that always has a place is behavior change and education. It's like the penicillin of treatment options. It's broad spectrum, effective over a wide range of landscapes, and essential to the sustainability and effectiveness of conservation initiatives. It's important to remember that people's behaviors and practices are not only influenced by knowledge and information, they're complex and nuanced, stemming from a dependency on biodiversity for food, medicine, and cultural identity. Women in particular have less access to education, disease prevention, and treatment, and are disproportionately affected by infectious disease. But when they are included, they have a profound ability to drive change. This script is just a starting point to help us recognize the importance of ecosystem health and to incorporate it into policy, funding streams, animal health surveillance, reporting, preparedness, and response systems to generate sustainable change and address root causes. Now, to see how this all comes together, we can look at the Campoman landscape in Cameroon and the Zanga-Zanga Protected Areas Complex in Central Africa, where a collaboration between WWF and the One Health Institute, the Helmholtz Institute, is supporting biodiversity to act as a natural barrier to climate change and reduce the risk of infectious disease. Wildlife are crucial for the local economy at both sites, but are affected by spillover and spillback of Ebola, anthrax, and many other infectious diseases. The program has established a data hub to bring together information from early warning systems, laboratory analysis, biomonitoring, and remote sensing to detect forest destruction and identify high-risk hotspots. This information then feeds into the suitability of area-based conservation measures and protected areas under the guidance and management of a consortium of transdisciplinary and multi-sectoral partners, alongside rangers, veterinarians, and doctors, all acting as first-line planetary health workers. It has required a shift in thinking from the needs of the individual to that of the community, from the health of a single species to that of all species. It can be daunting, and we are certainly still learning. But nature is an excellent teacher. Carrying capacity in wild populations is maintained by disease, destruction, and famine. Metapopulations of elephants move to distribute their grazing impact. And seasonal fires support germination. And when we consider planetary health as so much more than just a means to human health, then we can begin to live as stewards to a healthy planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prishani. I was very impressed by that outfit when you treat the hippo. Did you see the space suit that he wears? Okay, thank you for this beautiful talk. So, the key brain behind this conference is this man, Peter Stenvinkel. He's not only a conference organizer, he's a professor of nephrologist, kidneys being fantastic sensors for stress on the organism. And you are branching out into looking at into how other mammals deal with their stress and what we can learn from that. And you have promised me a few bears.
Yes. Thank you, Maria. I have been thinking about your request of wearing something colorful. It doesn't make very good sense. But actually, I found a solution, and I think during this meeting we want to reuse and recycle. So I will use Ray Lemery's scarf and reuse it.
The conference scarf.
The conference scarf for this meeting. Yeah, we are here to connect the dots, and I'm really even more convinced today than I was 2 days ago that we that work in health professions, we really need to understand these intimate links between our human health and the animal health, the deforestation, global warming, lack of clean water that we heard about, loss of biodiversity, and not last but not least, how we produce and consume our food. And I really believe even more now that medicine can serve as a window through which we can observe the world and try to understand it better. And I really also believe that health is the new phase of climate change, and this is something we need to communicate to our politicians. I'm a nephrologist and worked with kidney disease for many years, and we are really worried in the kidney community because chronic kidney disease is set to become the world's 5th leading cause of death by 2050. Today, 1 out of 10 people on our planet have kidney disease, and it will increase further. And the reason for this is that the kidneys are particularly vulnerable to the rapidly changing environment. And we believe that this rising global incidence of kidney disease is a reflection of the impact of climate change. And there are numerous papers now showing that microplastics pandemics, lack of clean water, ultra-processed food, heat stress that Annika Wernersson talked about, toxins, and air pollution increases the risk for chronic kidney disease. So I would say that kidney disease could be considered the black lungs of climate change, an indicator of the state of our planet. To understand planetary health, aging is extremely important, and chronological age is probably the most commonly used risk parameter we use in healthcare. But starting to think of what chronological age actually is, you get a little bit puzzled. 1 year is defined as the time it takes for the Earth to complete one full revolution around the Sun. How could that be a risk factor for disease and death? It's not time per se that ages. It's more and more clear that it's the wear and tear, the exposome that Paul Shields talked about, that ages, and that gives us our biological age. We all have a biological age. Some of you may have a younger biological age than your chronological age, and I congratulate you. Most of us may have a biological age that corresponds fairly well to the chronological age, but the problematic group are those patients we have in our hospitals with an older biological age than chronological age. There's a large gap between health span and lifespan, and that causes a lot of problems. And even further, we now see that's what's happening on our planet with heat stress, air pollution, plastics, stimulate exactly the same mechanisms that drive aging, suggesting that environmental crisis which will make us biologically older. And we see already now a lot of evidence for this. Environmental threats contribute to accelerated biological aging. We have seen papers like this one recently published that lack of water, dehydration is something that accelerates biological aging and premature mortality. And of course, we learned that the COVID-19 pandemic made us biologically older for many different reasons. Air pollution is something that stimulates epigenetic clocks, make us biologically older. And there are also evidence suggesting that climate warming is something that makes all species on our planet biologically older. So environmental health is overlooked in longevity research, and this was just published a couple of weeks ago, actually very well describing how alterations in the environmental quality with exposure to environmental contaminants, air pollution, organic pollutants, plastics, and of course lifestyle factors will accelerate the disruption of the cellular homeostasis. And here we have a number of things we can measure: the intracellular production of reactive oxygen species, mitochondrial dysfunction, DNA damage, chronic inflammation, telomere shortening. And we all know that this is causing an epigenetic age acceleration, development of chronic diseases, and at the end, shortening of healthy lifespan. We talked about food yesterday, and there is now even evidence that there is a causal relationship between the intake of red meat and biological aging. And center in all this scenario, we have a transcription factor, NRF2, which is expressed in all our tissues, and although the levels may vary between different organs. And this is a transcription factor that was developed during the great oxygenation event 2.4 billion years ago, when there was massive amounts of oxygen released from the oceans, and then life needed protection against oxygen, which we know is quite harmful. And NRF2 was then developed, and we know now that it's an essential transcription factor that protects us against inflammation and oxidative stress. I used 1 week a couple of years ago just to go through the literature to see what was found about the expression of this transcription factor in the diseasome of aging. And these are all diseases that accumulate as we get older. And irrespective, if we talk of diabetes, if we talk of fatty liver, in depression, periodontal disease, chronic kidney disease, Alzheimer, heart disease, the expression of NRF2 is low. So we have a situations now when we are exposed to processed food, with the climate change, water shortage, pollution, decline of biodiversity, that we humans will face an increasing exposure to conditions that promote the disease of aging. And that is really worrisome. We need to find solutions. So you should not curse the darkness, but you should try to light a candle. And that's what I will try to do now. So every dimension of human activity is rich with solutions. So we have been very inventive during our many thousand years from now. And hopefully human activity can also help bring back our humanity back into balance with our natural systems. And here I was intrigued by this German pathologist, Rudolf Virchow, that said that between animal and human medicine there are no dividing lines, nor should there be. The object is of course different, but the experience obtained constitutes the basis of all medicine. We are all animals. Albert Einstein said that you should look deep into nature and you will understand everything better. I think we can agree that he was right, as in almost everything he said. And here I find this novel discipline of biomimetics really interesting. It's a growing field of research that examines how nature is structured and tries to emulate in different applications. Nature is not only the oldest model, measure and mentor we humans could ask for, but it's also, of course, the supra-system in which all organizations on this planet are inserted. We already heard about this sixth major mass extinction and this massive biodiversity loss, and this again data from World Wildlife Foundation. Especially worried, of course, what you see in Latin America and the Caribbean with 94% biodiversity loss. Biological diversity forms the foundation for ecosystem function and the ability to provide the services that are vital for protecting against diseases and for our human survival and well-being. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, he composed this very beautiful serenade in 1787, Eine kleine Nachtmusik. It's a piece of music with many tones. It sounds very good. But if you would remove tones from this piece of music at the same rate as we lose species from our planet, this piece of music will not sound very good today. And if you look 100 years from now, in 2125, there may not be many tones left in this beautiful piece of music. And this may be something that you could remember what you think when you want to realize the impact of losing a species on our planet. So we should stop acting like fishermen with short-term gain and long-term loss, more destroying than surviving. And maybe we should all become more of marine biologists to understand and preserve the beauty of nature for the protection for future generations. And I think biodiversity offers so many solutions because it has been shaped for millions of years of evolution, and this has been driven by natural selection of organisms that have adapted to extreme environmental changes. The same changes that now threaten us humans. It's pollutions, it's heat stress, loss of clean water. And we already see in the animal kingdom very ingenious solutions. I think, Rick Johnson, you will discuss more about lack of clean water and how this have been ingenious methods that have been developed in some species to survive with almost no water. We have the killifish here that have adapted extremely very well-suited evolutionary rescue from extreme environmental pollution in the Gulf of Mexico. It's not the Gulf of America, it's the Gulf of Mexico. We have also the shape-shifting you see in some animals that is a response to climate warming. So animals are already adapting to the changes in the environment. And of course, COVID-19 and this unique host defense mechanism you find in bats that can harbor really aggressive viruses without being sick. And we learned from bats many years before the COVID epidemic that very robust interferon responses is vital for combating COVID-19. So we can use nature-based solutions to protect planetary health, and we already have many examples. For example, plants as medicine. About 1/3 of the medicines we use today comes from plants. We have Forxiga as an example. SGLT2 inhibitors come from the bark of the apple tree. We have animal poisons that can be used as medicine. ACE inhibitors that has been so important for the treatment of patients with kidney disease, heart failure, and diabetes actually originate from the venom of this Brazilian viper. We have Ozempic, semaglutide, and we should not forget that Ozempic literally came from a monster, the Gila monster, in the South American, North Mexican deserts. We can learn a lot from eating habits in animals that live in extreme environments to understand what to eat and not to eat. And here we are, of course, especially interested in the bears and the big cats. We learn from solutions in animals that survive in extreme environments. Metabolic patterns in animals that do not age can give us a lot of clues. And of course, fruits. And here I'm especially interested in what Amazonas can bring. And deforestation is one of the major problems now in our world, especially in the Brazil Amazon. Together with Denise Mafra, somewhere here in the audience, we look through what the content of this more than 200 Amazonian fruits you never really heard of. It's an amazing source of bioactive nutrients for human health. So we have many different solutions that we can use in nature. This is just an example of them. We have the giraffes with this extremely high blood pressure, but they never get stroke, kidney failure, or heart failure. We have the Greenland shark that lived for more than 500 years, develops ingenious mechanisms to protect their life. And we have the elephants that rarely develop cancer. And then, of course, we have the bears, the metabolic magicians. So hibernation is extremely interesting. Now here we have a very, very tired bear. He was, I think it's a he was so tired that he didn't really have the effort to climb into the den. So this is how he was sleeping. This is me looking into a den. And what do you think I found in here?
A bear.
A bear, no. I actually found the president of Karolinska Institute. So that was a big surprise. So hibernation is really something that we could use to find solutions for burden of lifestyle diseases. And we know that bears do not lose muscle. It was recently shown that essential in this is the activation of this transcription factor NRF2. So it seems like animals that live in extreme environments, they have a high expression of NRF2. That gave us some clues. Nature also always wants to counteract X aggregations from within. And when you go through the literature, you actually find that irrespective if animals are subjected to global warming, toxins, lack of clean water, or pollution, an upregulation of NRF2 seems to be important to withstand this. This can give us some clues how we should protect ourselves when we are exposed to these environmental threats. NRF2 is an extremely interesting transcription factor. You can affect the levels by how you live your life, how you eat, if you exercise or not. We know that NRF2 is of importance for if you are subjected to air pollution, for protection. You can protect yourself with some drugs that stimulate NRF2, metformin, statins, and lithium, but I find it even more interesting that certain bioactive compounds, fermented food stimulated NRF2. We know that this may be something you can use to protect populations that live in air-polluted areas. Broccoli sprouts is probably the most potent NRF2 agonist sulforaphane. This is just an example of what happens to rats, old rats giving sulforaphane, and you can see the difference between those on the control and the sulforaphane diet. And the publications in high-ranking journals actually show that broccoli sprouts have quite robust effects. So osteoporosis is something bears do not suffer. If you stay in bed for 4 or 5 months, you usually lose a lot of both bone and muscle mass, but bears don't. So here we transported a CT scan from Karolinska to the northern woods of Sweden. And here you can see that compared to the adult sheep immobilized for 4 months, you see the enormous loss of bone mass. But in 1 year and 18-year-old grizzly bears, there's absolutely no loss of bone mass. It's interesting to do sampling of bears during hibernation, and you see here that there is really a massive change in metabolic and cardiovascular risk factors. If you would send an hibernating bears to a doctor, they will find it's a perfect storm for atherosclerosis. They are sedentary, they have type 2 diabetes during hibernation, kidney disease and dyslipidemia. Nevertheless, they are totally resistant to atherosclerosis. And we recently found, together with Johan Frostergård, that there is a kind of a potential natural immunization against atherosclerosis. And this may be a lead for vaccination against atherosclerosis in the future. But these are wild animals. And Johanna, you are sitting there. You published this very, very interesting study, and you have actually done a great job in rescuing these very poor bile acid bears that you find in China and Vietnam. They live in horrible conditions like this, giving crappy food. But what you also showed, which I find even more interesting, is that these bears, they develop the burden lifestyle diseases we see in humans. They are not protected as their wild counterparts. They have hypertension, obese sarcopenia, chronic inflammation, degenerative joint disease. So I believe that the true clues that we get from the animal kingdom are mainly found in the wild animals, not in domesticated and captivated animals. And with this, I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Peter. We are going to continue with another man who needs to, he wants a scarf too.
Yeah.
Hey. So Rick Johnson is with us from the University of Colorado. We talked about the metabolism of other animals. So what can they tell us about human metabolism and reaction to stressors? This talk has a very interesting headline, From Fat to Water. Rick, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I want to first begin by thanking the organizers. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Paul. This has been a great meeting, and I've enjoyed it a lot. And I'm going to tell a little story that's kind of an evolution. and it's going to be a kind of about survival and how we can learn from nature, how animals survive, and under stress, and we're seeing this happening now, of course, and of how we can learn from that to develop new insights into our own biology. So we learned a little bit about life this morning, about what life is, and critical for life is for survival is to make sure you have enough food, that you have enough water, and that you have enough oxygen. And all animals have evolved mechanisms to protect themselves. And in fact, some of them have learned how to protect themselves from future crises. It's sort of like Aesop's fable of the ant and the grasshopper. If you can prepare before the disaster comes, you have a much better chance to live, to survive. And today we're going to talk about the critical aspect of survival related to having enough water, which is extremely relevant to the meeting and to what animals in the wild are going through with climate change. So the first thing to realize is that all animals have to have enough water. The water is used to help maintain the osmolality of the blood, to set up the internal milieu that allows the chemical reactions of life. And we think that many animals get most of their water by drinking it, by going to sources where there's water. But actually, many, many animals get most of their water from their food. And so the food turns out to be a major source of water for most animals. And so those are the two major mechanisms for water intake. But then when there's a shortage of water, you also have to learn how to store it or how to reduce losses. And some animals actually have bladders that they can store water in. Mainly amphibians like frogs and turtles actually also can store water in bladders. And in the Galapagos, the Galapagos turtles used to store a lot of water in their bladders because there's not much fresh water on the island other than the rains that rarely come. And also bears also can, they do urinate a little bit and they'll reabsorb the water from their bladders. But this is not a very common way to store water. And so much of survival relates to reducing losses. And, some animals will retreat to dens that are humidified so they can reduce the evaporative water loss. Or they, for example, will only forage at night. Some have developed physical adaptations, like the camel has nares that can close to reduce water vapor loss through the lungs and so forth. But perhaps the most effective way to reduce water losses is to have a very effective urinary concentration system. And that actually is associated with a hormone called vasopressin. And as probably many of you know, this hormone, which is released from the brain, acts on the kidney to concentrate urine by reabsorbing water. And it's a very effective mechanism. And some desert animals, for example, can concentrate their urine 5 times better than we can, more than concentrated than seawater. And this is a major mechanism for how animals protect themselves. And so vasopressin turns out to be sort of the water hormone because it helps reabsorb water. Now, interestingly, vasopressin, an ancestral form of vasopressin, is called vasotocin. And in the frog, vasotocin actually works on the skin to block water loss through the skin, and it works in the bladder to block water loss from the bladder. And there's actually vasopressin receptors that are in the cecum that might help theoretically remove water from stool. And there's also V2 receptors or vasopressin receptors in the lung. And so you start realizing that vasopressin may actually have more functions to reabsorb water than just the kidney, which is what all of us were taught. And so we're going to get to that, but what I wanted very shortly about this, but I want to say that there's another source of water that we haven't talked about here, and it's a very important one, and that is that fat can be turned into water. Fat doesn't contain water, but when fat is metabolized, it generates water. And it also, glycogen, which is the storage form of carbohydrate, when it breaks down, it actually produces even more water. So it turns out that when we store fat and when we store glycogen, we're actually sort of storing water. There's not water in fat, but we generate water. And in fact, many desert animals will actually store fat in their, like the hump or in the back of their neck or like in their tails. Ectopic fat is very, very common in animals in the desert, and they will use this if they need to as a water source. This is a great example of a physiologic study in which they took a desert hopping mouse that was chronically stressed. It lives in an environment where there's not much water, And they compared them to a lab mouse, and they did dehydration. And what happens is if you dehydrate a regular mouse, or if we get dehydrated, what happens is glycogen will burn and will oxidize our glycogen in our liver to generate water. And when people go on a keto diet, they'll tell you that you're going to get a diuresis, and that's because you're breaking down glycogen and releasing water. And that's the normal initial response. And you see it actually with both species, and it's associated with anorexia because it's called dehydration anorexia. But in an animal that's chronically on stress, that's going to kill it eventually if they don't eat. So what they do is there's a rebound where they actually eat more than they normally eat as an attempt to get more water. Because remember, food is a source of water. They try to make it up by eating more food, and they start burning fat. So you'll see this transition. But they can't burn the fat super long. It can work for several weeks, but it can't last completely long because they'll burn off the fat and then they'll die. But you'll see that there's this interesting system by which these animals can survive. And it involves burning glycogen acutely, kind of the big rapid way to generate water. And then there's more of a chronic way, which is to burn fat. And it turns out that many animals use fat on a daily basis to survive. So in the seas, whales, for example, they don't drink salt water. They don't drink salt water. So they get most of their water from their food, but they get about 25% of their water from their fat. Nesting penguins will get a lot of water from their fat. There's the desert frog that fills itself out. It has these big fat pads that insulate it from the sand from the hot sun, and it will burrow and burn its, it will oxidize fat in order for it to survive. And even the locusts, when they migrate, they're burning fat to provide them both water and calories to survive. Now, I just kind of got ahead of myself earlier, but I mentioned that vasopressin is a hormone that seems to be important in not just water retention from the kidney, but may actually have other functions. And so our group began to think, well, since fat can be a source of water, is it possible that vasopressin might have a role in fat storage? Because it would be another way to generate water. And when you look at the literature, there's an overwhelming report, hundreds of papers that report that vasopressin is high in people with metabolic syndrome. Vasopressin, which is sometimes it can be measured as a copeptin, is actually a stable derivative of vasopressin. But it turns out vasopressin is high in obesity, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, all these different diseases. And it correlates and predicts. If you have a high vasopressin level, it predicts the development of obesity. And not only that, but people who are obese tend to be mildly dehydrated. They have high vasopressin levels, and they are dehydrated. In this one study, if you're obese, you're 12-fold more likely to be dehydrated than a person who's not obese. And so suddenly you start seeing, there may be an association between vasopressin, metabolic fat, metabolic water and fat, and obesity. So this takes me, I'm sorry we're going to kind of jump, but this takes me to what causes obesity. And my group and others, but especially work from our group, has focused on the role of sugar and of fructose in the development of obesity. And I'm not going to take you through it all, but what we found is that if you feed a mouse, especially like sugar or high fructose corn syrup or soft drinks, they become obese and they develop insulin resistance and they develop diabetes over time and they develop hypertension and they develop all the syndromes of metabolic syndrome. They get aging, and by the way, NRF2 drops dramatically. It inhibits that very important transcription factor. And it causes fatty liver and all that. And we went on and showed that fructose actually stimulates foraging. It actually induces syndromes that sort of look like ADHD because you have to be impulsive and move through and, you know, find that food and you can't deliberate and you can't focus. You just need to go. And it stimulates fat accumulation, fat production, insulin resistance, systemic inflammation, all of these things. And it even reduces oxygen needs, believe it or not. So it seemed like it was a survival nutrient. And guess what? When you give fructose to an animal or to humans, it stimulates vasopressin. So it's like a survival factor. And here it is, stimulating vasopressins. And so the question is, could the vasopressin have a role in the obesity that's driven by sugar? This is all coming from thinking about metabolic fat, right? Metabolic water. And it turns out that vasopressin has a receptor besides the one that causes urinary concentration. There's a receptor that raises blood pressure, and there's a receptor that drives ACTH, which is the big hormone that stimulates cortisol, which if you have expand cortisol and have very high levels, you get Cushing syndrome with obesity. And it stimulates glucagon, which also tends to cause diabetes type signs. But no one really knew what V1B receptor did in people, or for that matter in animals. There wasn't much evidence of what it did. We knew how it acted. But when we knocked out the vasopressin 1B receptor, we found that we could completely block the effects of sugar to cause obesity. We blocked the development of fat. We blocked fatty liver. We blocked insulin resistance. And it told us that, that this vasopressin pathway of survival that animals are using in the wild might actually be relevant to us. So we did a study where we hydrated animals who were getting sugar. We gave them sugar, but then we hydrated them. And when you hydrate an animal, you're going to suppress the vasopressin levels, which we did. And look, we had this magnificent effect on obesity and diabetes. And you see a lot of skinny people running around drinking lots of bottles of water. I used to think it was like, it's just an association, but it might actually have a causal interaction. There may be something good about drinking a lot more water, 6 to 8 glasses a day. And in fact, in Horning did a study, or no, actually this is our work. But so if you give a glass of juice, juice is filled with sugar, right? If you give a glass of apple juice, guess what happens? Vasopressin goes up in the blood of humans. ACTH goes up. Cortisol goes up. Glucagon goes up. It's the same formula. Whenever you eat cake and sugar, you are activating a pathway involved in survival, a pathway to generate fat. And not only that, this was done by Horning. He took people and he gave them, he hydrated them. These are obese people, and look, acutely you can drop glucagon. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go back to nature. So now we started with metabolic fat, or metabolic water from fat, and we came to this exciting conclusion that actually it could explain obesity in humans to some extent. And we even found a hormone that drove it. But now let's go back to nature, to the animals that most importantly try to survive hard winters, the hibernating animal. And interestingly, when in the autumn they start eating and they become very fat, and actually it's almost like a switch, and they're making a ton of carbohydrate-dependent oxidation, which is what fructose does, and they have high vasopressin levels. And one of the interesting things that unfortunately I don't have time to go into is you can make fructose in your body. You don't have to eat it. and you can make it from different kinds of foods. And my suspicion is that these guys are producing fructose in their body. And we've shown that bears, for example, with Peter, they have high fructose levels before they hibernate. And then when they hibernate, their vasopressin falls and they start burning fat. It's sort of the story. And so the question is, what triggers an animal to go into torpor? And one of the theories is that it's water restriction. And in fact, it is. If you take animals and you restrict their water, they will go into hibernation, especially if you do it kind of randomly. So every few days you completely restrict water. They go into hibernation at a faster rate. The duration of torpor is longer, and the frequency is higher. In other words, when they get really fat and the winter comes, it turns out that what a major trigger is when they start developing water needs. And then when they're in torpor, interestingly, they have these things called interbout arousals, in which they'll drop their temperature. They'll be like these little frozen, squirrels for like 2 weeks. They're burning fat, and then they have this arousal where their temperature goes up, and they switch from burning fat to burning glycogen. And one of the things that's incredible about the hibernating animals, while it's burning fat, it produces glycerol, which is slowly being converted to glycogen. And then after 2 weeks, the glycogen is high. And then what happens is they can't maintain their water supply, sufficient water from burning the fat. So they switch to burn glycogen to produce that big water surge. And then that's associated with this arousal. It's not like proven that this is the mechanism, but this is what is happening. So it's consistent with what we know. It suggests that, and then you can do that. You can induce arousal by water restricting or reducing the humidity in the den. So when you reduce the humidity, the evaporative water loss goes up, and they wake up, and it's totally related to water loss. So if you want to get an animal to wake up, you make its water restriction to the point where they can't maintain their water by burning fat. It is totally cool. And if this is true, then you would think that if you gave vasopressin, or that when an animal arouses, its vasopressin should go up, and it does. So when they arouse, vasopressin goes up, fat oxidation goes down, they burn the glycogen, and then they can go back. And if you give vasopressin to a hibernating animal, it wakes up. So I would like to end by saying that by studying nature, we can not only help understand the mechanisms of survival for animals in nature, but we can take it back to us, where we can then learn how biology is driving disease in us. We are married to nature. We need to, as Peter says, we need to understand nature to help nature and to help ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Food for thought. I'm thinking of the American diet, the fructose, the juices, the muffins. That's like a fructose bomb in the morning.
Yes.
Also in other countries.
Yes.
Okay, we have now been with bears. We had a little snake. Not enough snakes, if you ask me. We have had camels, all sorts of rats. And we are now going to go to the real hard workers of nature, insects. 80% of all species on Earth are insects, and they are great pollinators, of course, extremely important for the web of life. Bees, butterflies, flies, moths, etc. But they can also be natural pest controllers, reducing the need for chemical pesticides. Fabrizia Ratto is here from the Royal Holloway University to look at the insects. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Very exciting to be here today, and I'm acutely aware we are all looking forward to our next coffee. So I am determined to keep this talk very positive. I'm focusing on solutions, and of course, as an ecologist, we're lucky because our subject always allow us for very nice, pretty pictures. So hopefully it will keep you awake until I'm done. So yes, I'm Fabrizia. I am an ecologist by trade. I teach at Royal Holloway University of London, and my overarching research interest is looking at how we can reconcile the needs of biodiversity conservation and those of humans. And I do this through insects. I am going to take you through a little bit of a journey, going from these tiny yet marvelous creatures and showing you how interlinked the biodiversity, the health of biodiversity is to our own health and our own well-being. So what's so special about insects? My answer to this is always, well, what is not so special about insects, right? So latest figures, I hope, these are the species, described species. So not all the species that we believe exist, but the species that we have described. And more than half of them are insects. So let's let that sink. So over 1 million species on the planet are insects. It's quite old picture just to show you the different orders that we categorize insect in. We have butterflies, flies, bees, coleoptera, which are the beetles, and all the other bugs. As you can see, the coleoptera, so the beetles are taking almost half of that wheel. Coleoptera are by far the most numerous group on the planet. So much so that the famous scientist Haldane, when he was asked about what his studies of nature had taught him about God, he ironically replied, an inordinate fondness for stars and beetles, because there are just so many. Also, in terms of biomass, insects form a vast majority of the biomass on Earth. So, if number of species, biomass, and also the sheer number of them is not enough, I also want to point your attention on what they are, their ecological function. So what we call the ecological functions, in simple words, what they do in the ecosystem. What do? They pollinate, they are natural enemies of pests, they recycle matter and organic material, they can be food for us. And in this not so recent paper, they have cleverly shown how insects and their functions in the ecosystems can link to the majority of the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we are looking at and what we call all these functions, I'm sure you're familiar with, is ecosystem services. And I know there was a bit of discussions over ecosystem services and whether we should focus on their value to us. Of course, I'm a tree hugger by trade. Of course, nature has to be protected for its own right, but sometimes we need to speak that language of what can they provide to us so that we can protect them. So let's delve a little bit into the details of these different functions. Pollination. I'm sure you've all heard about pollination and the plight of the bee, even though there are about 20,000 species of bees on the planet. It is not the honeybee that is under threat. Let me have this quick rant. We have to concentrate on wild bees. Those are the ones that are under threat. But just let me give you a few numbers. 75% of the globally important crop types, and I'm going to stress on this, is not the 75% of all crops, is of the globally important crops. That includes fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, coffee, and cocoa. They depend to some degrees on animal pollination. When we look at the overall food production, then we are talking about 30% that is contributed to by animal pollination. If we look at the biomass of the whole production, the numbers are a bit smaller. It's about 5 to 8% of global food production that will be lost without pollination services. So it might seem like a bit of a small number, but what I want to focus on is what they pollinate. So we heard before that the majority of our food and calories come from a few crops that are cereals, such as wheat, etc. Those are wind pollinated. So we wouldn't starve without pollinators, but the majority of the vitamins and lipids and the calcium and all these other vitamins that we need to have a varied diet are contained mostly in animal pollinated crop. And again, of course, we're not here for the money, but often when we attach a price tag to nature is when often decision makers listen to us. So this is, I hope, one of the latest figures of the value of pollination services to human and to the annual global improvement of crop output. I need a coffee. And it's about 235 to 577 billion dollars. So it is not peanuts what pollinators do for us. Just briefly, I know I focus a lot on insects because they are the major pollinators, but I don't want to forget the often forgotten pollinators that are also in other groups. We have mammals, small mammals, bats, birds are pollinators as well. So insects can be pests. I'm sure that many of you, when you think about insects, you think about pests, you think about disease vectors. But I promised I was going to be positive, so I'm not going to focus too much on the problems they cause. I want to concentrate on the solutions that they provide. But, for example, I don't know how familiar you are with this pest. It's called the fall armyworm. It has invaded sub-Saharan Africa and is creating a lot of issues, especially with weeds, completely devastating wheat crops. But insects can also be what we call natural enemies of pests. So they can literally eat them. So we have all our predators, predatory wasps, spiders, even if they are not insects, but we count them in the mix. Beetles, for example, ladybirds are voracious eaters of aphids, so they are great for pest control. And then we have our parasitic wasps. They are a very numerous group of tiny wasps, and indulge me in talking to you briefly about their amazing life cycle. Is an evolutionary marvel. So the adult of the parasitic wasp, they lay the eggs in the live caterpillar of their host, and then those eggs will hatch and they will literally eat the caterpillar alive, which is a fantastic adaptation. It's quite a brutal lifestyle, so much so that even the man, Charles Darwin, was horrified by this life cycle, and he just couldn't reconcile the idea of a benevolent God with such a life cycle. But I leave it to you to decide how you want to take this. So I cannot talk about insects without talking about their decline. We know that they've been on a steady decline for the last few decades. Usual culprits are the cause of the decline: climate change, pollution, loss of habitat fragmentation, etc., etc. What I would like to concentrate here for the rest of the talk is agricultural intensification, because of course we can also provide some solutions within this phase. We have heard before about conventional agriculture, and how of course is completely focusing on production, so there isn't a lot of space for habitat and habitat for biodiversity, heavy use of pesticides and fertilizers, which has decreased the quality of the habitat, the quality of the soil, and decreased all those free ecosystem services that we receive from nature. So, one of the solutions, and this is the discipline I work within, is called agroecology. So what we can do is just shift the paradigm within agriculture, because we're not going to get away from agriculture. We need to produce food, population are increasing, so we need to secure production in a more sustainable way. And we can do this by applying all those ecological knowledge about the ecological processes and the links between living beings, their interactions, and translate them into agricultural systems and practices, which can be fairly simple. If you think about insects in terms of what they need food, they need shelter, they need nesting sites, some of them. Okay, so we can recreate some of that habitat within food production. And it can be done in the UK. We have a lot of hedgerows around, fields that we are trying to restore because we have lost them as well. You can plant wildflowers within the crops or around the crops. You can create what we call beetle banks. So it's habitat for shelter and overwintering for insects. So it's really just about recreating that habitat within food production. And there is quite a large volume of literature now that shows that it actually works. It does increase populations of insects, pollinators, and natural enemies of pests, and they also improve crop. They improve crop yield and they improve crop quality. I'll just give you a quick example of some work I've been involved with a few years ago in South Africa on apple orchards. So as I said, we know that integrating those floral resources and habitats for insects increases the abundance of wild insects and the services that they deliver. And we also know that the quality of the habitat surrounding farms can also moderate that effect. But a lot of research has been done in the global north, so in Europe and North America. We just wanted to understand whether that was translatable into other habitat. So what we did, we went into the Cape region, floristic region, which I would recommend to everyone. Is a biodiversity hotspot. It's a beautiful place, but they do have quite heavy agricultural production in terms of apple orchards. So what we did, we planted wildflowers within the orchard rows, and then we did what ecologists do. That is the fun part of my job. We go out and measure stuff and count insects. Those are pollination experiments. So what you can do is to cover the flower with a net, so you prevent pollinators from pollinating. Thank you. And then you can supplement flower with pollen, and that allows us to compare the yield from non-pollinated flowers and those that have been pollinated, so we can give a measure of the contribution of insects to the quantity and quality of the crop. And then, of course, there is also lab work where we measure apples and weigh apples, etc., look at the sugar contents. Won't bore you too much with the results, but the bottom line is it works, and it works also in these systems. So we saw that there was a 15% increase in honeybee abundance and also wild bees abundance when they were in the fields with this flower cover. Interestingly, we also found that open pollinated apples that were by these wildflowers, they were bigger, they were heavier, and they had a higher concentration of sugar contents. So what that means is that the simple solution, they increase biodiversity within fields, but they also increase crop production and quality. And then there is biological pest control. As we said, is the use of those natural enemies to combat pests, which allows us to use perhaps less pesticides. So we have natural biocontrol, which is you don't have to do anything. They are just out there doing their job and controlling populations. There is classical biological control, where a specific natural enemy is physically introduced within a field. The one I work with in particular is called conservation biological control. And what that means, again, is about creating that habitat for natural enemies or pests so that we can naturally enhance the populations within farms. I just want to give you this great example that was devised by ISIPE in Kenya. This is a type of intercropping, which means literally putting more than one crop within the same fields, and it's called push-pull. This is because they use one plant called Desmodium within the wheat that releases a volatile chemical that physically repels the pest. So the pest tends to move away, and then they plant Napier grass on the outside, which releases a volatile that attracts the pest. So physically we push and pull the pests out of the field. Again, allowing natural pest control and less use of pesticides. And also, this type of practices, they also help another suite of ecosystem services. They improve the soil, they improve retention of carbon in the soil, so water retention. So it's all synergistically happening. We wanted to understand how effective they were. So again, we did some work a few years ago, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and we looked at all the different types of biological control. So conservation biological control, we also included botanical pesticides in the mix. That is not literally using natural enemies, but indirectly. And we actually found that it does work. Pest abundance is reduced by about 63%, crop damage is reduced about 50%, and crop yield is increased by about 60%. But the interesting bit for me is the last point, is the fact that when we compared the effectiveness of biological control with synthetic pesticides, we had very similar results, but the fields with biological control, they had more natural enemies in them. So it's that win-win situation where we have an enhanced biodiversity whilst we have a benefit to us. I'm going to leave you with this last. I could talk forever about the benefits of insects, also the intrinsic ones, and I'm happy to talk to you during coffee about it if you are interested. I just wanted to point out medicinal plants, because when you think about medicinal plants, pollinators and insects is probably not the first thing that comes to your mind. We all know, I don't need to tell you how important medicinal plants are across the world. A large majority of people in the global south rely on traditional remedies for their healthcare. But we also, in the global north, we use natural remedies as an additional part of our health, as an alternative medicine. 96% of wild plants species are recorded as medicinal. These are numbers by Kew Garden. And about 84%, so 28,000 species of medicinal plants are flowering plants. So who pollinates them? Insects. So they rely on animal pollination for their existence. Medicinal plants are also threatened because the majority of medicinal plants are wild harvested. So there is a problem with over-harvesting in the wild. So about 21% of medicinal plant species worldwide are now under threat. And we also know that that can be compounded with the decline of pollinators. So how is that going to work? And how resilient are medicinal plants in the long term? So what we are doing, I don't have the answer yet, but this is our ongoing study. We asked the big question at a global level: what is the contribution of pollinators to the reproductive success of medicinal plants? We are going to run a systematic review and meta-analysis. I'm sure all the medical doctors are very familiar with this technique. We are going to have, this is not just an academic exercise. My aim is to also get to a point where we can find perhaps particular regions of the world, particular medicinal plants that are under threat and that perhaps need further research, but also finding a way to find solutions and data to inform conservation, to inform policies, and also growing medicinal plants, not in the wild. So we are working with this very small company in the Italian Alps. They are growing Arnica montana, that is very popular in Italy and in Europe as a medicinal plant. Because if we work on understanding what the relationship is of these medicinal plants with their pollinators, and we can provide some effective management options for growing medicinal plants, then we can release that pressure from wild populations, and we can ensure the long-term resilience of medicinal plants and, of course, of our health. I'm just going to finish with, well, thank you, but if you take away two messages from my talk, is that biodiversity is so strictly interlinked, and the health of biodiversity and their ecosystem is so interlinked with our health as well. And the last message is that maybe I hope that after this talk, the next time an insect lands on your sandwich while you're having your picnic, you won't whack it, but you will take a second to look at them and with a newly found respect. Thank you very much.